Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. My name is Daniel Taylor. I'm the owner here at Jesus Was the Carpenter, and welcome to part 2 of our do-it-yourself series on built-in cabinetry. So as we said in part 1, we're building a set of built-ins for one of our clients in South Carolina. We're doing some cabinetry for their laundry room, and so part 1 was all devoted to all the stages of planning and development. And so we were going all through all of our design work. I was talking about how it is that I design our projects, how I develop cut lists, and now we're finally ready to start dimensioning. So here I am, putting up our panels on the track saw. Let's get to it with part 2. All right, so here we are getting through this cut list, checking off different items as we go through them and stacking them up on the back of this miter saw wall by component. And once everything has been finished in the cut list, I start bringing panels over to the Craig jig station. I've got my Craig K5 set up and just kind of pounding through some pocket screws, making sure I get the right orientation on those panels. Especially when they're square like this, it's kind of easy to get things flopped around by accident, 90 degrees or so. And then we're ready to move forward. So we're in the final step of our assembly prep. So we've cut everything, we dimensioned it, we pocket screwed everything, and now I'm in the final stage for this build is going to be adding our adjustable shelf pin holes. I would say probably out of all the different processes for cabinet work, I feel like there's some I really enjoy and there's some I don't enjoy quite as much. And I think drilling shelf pin holes is probably one of those for me. It's a tedious, time-consuming, and kind of boring thing to do. But it's a great thing to add into your cabinets, and it's not particularly difficult if you have the right tools. It just takes time. It's kind of annoying. So I'm gonna try to take out some of those pain points for you in this part of the video. And honestly, I probably could do an entire video just for shelf pin holes. So I'm just gonna try to keep things as concise as possible as to what I do. But basically, I'll give you a quick rundown of kind of how we've done it traditionally, some pain points we ran into traditionally, and how I found now is the best way and most efficient way, at least for us, to do it. And if you've got a more efficient way, by all means, please put it down below. I would love to get better at efficiency and accuracy with shelf pin holes. So at the height of this past year, I had about 15 employees at one time. That's a lot of folks in one shop. And we were having some difficulties with consistency with shelf pin holes. And some of it was because we had so many moving pieces. Some of it was training. Some of it was focus, and some of it was the wrong tools. But eventually we ended up settling on a better tool, we thought, and it still wasn't that great. So a lot of it was also focus. Whoever is doing the shelf pin holes, I teach the team like this. The shelf pins, drilling the shelf pins, is like for a cook, like cutting up and getting ready to serve blowfish. My understanding about blowfish is you have to cut it a certain way. It takes a lot of training. If you mess it up, someone can actually die. And the chef himself has to eat it, he or she, before they serve it. Okay, this is life or death here. But by the time we've gotten to shelf pin holes, there's been about 4 or 5 or 6 processes that have happened to those particular items up until that point. And usually someone doesn't like severely mess up shelf pin holes on just one panel. They're doing like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 panels wrong. So why is that an issue? Because let's say you have like multiple upper bookshelves beside each other. Those shelf pin holes have to be on the money. And if you get let's say you're doing like mini, and then you're having to move the jig up. Every time that you get up higher and higher on those shelf pin holes, it's like factorially, if you have an issue with consistency down low, then by the time you get to the top, it's even worse. And it could affect whether shelves line up across the whole ensemble of cabinetry. So we've had issues with that. We've had to redo things. On a paint grade, sometimes you can get away with putting, Bondo or high performance filler in the holes, sanding it, doing that fill work a few times to cover up the old bad holes. Sometimes you have to go back and replace the whole panel. And that could get expensive, not just in time, which is important, that is money, but also materials, because plywood's not cheap. So I think a lot of us start with these Craig shelf pin holes. They're easily available. You can go out on Lowe's, get one that same day, and you can put some of them together, right? And but even if you put 2 together, you still only get 10 holes worth. What we found is, personally, we found that putting these together didn't give us consistency. Even if you look at the side, it's got a bevel here. I don't know what genius thought of that, but when you put them together, look, it wants to do that. Or you've got a gap, and that gap's not consistent. So I don't care what you say. You can start on this side and be as precise as possible, but you're not gonna have consistency. So then the next step up for us, we got this Bighorn unit off of Amazon, and that was a little bit better, but we were still having problems between consistency from side to side. Again, some of that was focus. Some of our employees just weren't putting enough focus into what they were doing, but I still think some of it was the jig. So ultimately, I ended up with this guy, which is basically a Rockler woodworking kind of knockoff that I got off of Amazon. And I love it, it's great. So far, it's been awesome. It's got a nice aluminum frame. And what I like about this is that you can set up and run shelf pin holes on both sides of the piece at the same time. So as long as your rack is positioned square and it's not, you know, skewed, which is possible to do, but as long as it's straight, you should have pretty consistent results. And what I usually do is make a little jig out of this scrap plywood that sits on the end here, and I clamp that in place. And when I clamp it in place, I'm looking here and here to make sure there's no gap and it's totally flush. That way I'm not getting an inconsistency in the distance of it to the top of that jig. I made this for a previous project. It just happened to work well for this one as well. But basically, you're just nailing some boards together at a 90-degree angle, and you're making sure that the length here of this board puts this jig starting at the correct position for your project. As long as I have the aluminum frame flush here and flush here, it should be square here. And then from there, I'm just tightening up this to make sure it's not loose and it's not racked. These screws have a tendency to kind of get loose, so I won't say this is the perfect jig, but it does a good job. The next thing is I'll painter's tape over any holes that I don't want to have, you know, to drill. I just make it really painfully hard for me to mess up if I drilled the wrong row of holes, for instance. So I've like literally painter's taped over the inside holes because I want to be further inside. I'm sorry, let me say that again. I've taped off the outside holes because I want to be further inside with the inside row. If I'm drilling every other hole, I'll literally take painter's tape and tape over the holes I don't want to drill. Why drill every other hole? Well, if you're in an upper bookshelf that's open, it doesn't have doors on it, that's a lot of holes to look at. It can look kind of IKEA looking. No offense, IKEA, but it can look kind of just stock looking. And so it's nice to do every other hole. It's an aesthetic improvement, I think, ever having to see a bunch of holes. And usually on upper towers, clients aren't looking for that much adjustability, so I'll okay that with them and say, hey, would you rather we do less holes so it's not so busy and drill every other hole? If it's a base cabinet, usually I do want the adjustability. That way they can adjust it, you know, with much more precision if they're doing like, you know, consoles, Alexas, VCRs, DVD players, whatever. They have some more adjustability in that base cabinet. Also, maybe I'm only putting one adjustable shelf in per the original contract, but then later on down the road, they can call me and they say, hey, Daniel, you know, can you make me a couple of extra shelves? I want to put some more, you know, media down my base cabinets, and they've got the shelf pin holes in place to have that kind of adjustability. So it's a good thing. And that's why I always say, by the way, clients plan, so I can look and just see, you know, how big were their old shelves. Okay, I'll make 2 more. So anyway, I set this up, I clamped it in place. I'm going to push this in place so it's flush with that. I'm going to clamp this in place so it can't move. No need to clamp the other side as long as it's straight. One side is sufficient. And then I'm going to go about drilling my holes. If you get wood chips in here, sometimes this self-centering bit won't come back to its starting position. If that happens, just keep going up and down with the drill, and eventually those shavings will get out of the way. I also like to have a vacuum nearby, a shop vac, just so I can go ahead and vacuum up all the different shavings so it doesn't get all over the floor. It just saves me a mess later. Always cognizant of dust and shavings in the area. If I'm going to be hopscotching or leapfrogging my way up for like a very long panel, I'll use these and put them in one of the holes to help me, you know, to center the jig on the last hole I just drilled and make sure that I'm staying consistent with my space between the 2 different sections of that panel. This comes with this jig. This jig was about $65, well spent, well spent. The Rockler jig's about 100, so if this one starts failing me, I'll get that one. But so far I really like it. I'll put a link to it in the description below this box if you'd like to order as well. I use these shelf pins, and by the way, I did an adjustable shelf pin or shelf video. I uploaded it last week. Check it out, all about how to make adjustable shelves. And I talked a little bit about these shelf pins in that, so if you haven't checked out that video, check that out. I gave a lot of information about how we make our built-in cabinet adjustable shelves. It's not exactly the most simple thing. There's a lot to it. But these are the shelf pins I use. They're 1/4-inch shelf pins, so thus I'm using a 1/4-inch drill bit. And I love these shelf pins. They've got like a rubber coating. So if you're doing white furniture, these are great. If you're doing like stained wood furniture, these are awesome. Or if you're doing like a green painted or a navy blue, anything that brown would be complementary to, I use these. They do have a brass body, whereas these have a chrome body. If for some reason either of these colors work well, you can just take off the coating and run it without the coating. So whatever engineer made these, great job. I get these off Amazon as well in bulk. I'll leave a link to that item in the description as well. They're very affordable there, I feel like. And they have a very nice premium feel to it. They don't feel like cheap plastic or like, you know, tiny little metal pins you get and you see at most, you know, builder grade furniture. So at this point, I'm going to go to a time lapse, and you can watch me, you know, drill through this panel. I've got no leapfrogging on this. It's just straight up setup and drill straight up to the last hole, which is wonderful for this. It's a little easier this go around. But a lot of times I'm leapfrogging like, you know, 2 or 3 times a panel, and I'm spending 2 hours on shelf pins. So a little bit more fortunate on this go around with this project. All right, I'm going to move on. Here we go. Let's drill some shelf pins. Guys, another quick little detail I wanted to add earlier but did not. You always want to make sure you mark the top of your shelf pin panel. Sometimes the difference between the bottom to the first shelf pin and the top to the first shelf pin is so close and aesthetic, it's hard to tell what's what. And so it could be really easy, if you can imagine, to mount those panels inverse by accident during your assembly. That would not be fun to find out like later down the line at the client's home or something. All right, so off camera, I realized that I actually did the shelf pin holes in the wrong orientation. This is actually an extra wide cabinet. It's not 23 inches wide. This one actually is 30 inches wide, which is longer than most cabinets, or wider, deeper than most cabinets I usually do. And so that kind of threw my eyes off, and I made a big mistake, which means I get to waste another sheet of plywood and cut 4 more panels and do these shelf pins over again. So maybe I should watch my own video and make sure I'm cutting that blowfish just right. Otherwise, someone's pocketbook could die. All right, so here I am, cut the other panels. I'm gonna flip this around if I can and show you guys something else about cutting with a track saw. When you're cutting with the track saw, you'll start to learn your edge band. It'll get eroded over time. When you first start using your track saw for the very first time, you can put this black strip, this rubber kind of, it's actually for the vacuum usually. You can put it right up to the tick mark of your measurement and it'll pretty much cut there. After you use it for a while, it gets worn down. So mine, I know I get off at about 1/16 of an inch on both sides, and that usually cuts where I want to. You kind of learn your saw. Another thing is, like, don't feel like you always have to use the clamps, the track clamps. Sometimes you do, but a lot of times you could just trust the rubber on the bottom of this thing to hold it in place. That'll save you a lot of time in your dimensioning. Having to constantly put those clamps on and unclamp them can really slow you down. So I usually only use it if I have to. If I got a shorter cut or a cross cut, I won't use the clamps. For a longer cut that's like the full board, yeah, maybe I'll go ahead and clamp it. Why not? All the sheet goods for this one I got at Home Depot. This is 3/16 of an inch underlayment for the rear panels. For the main cabinets, we use 3/4 of an inch thick birch plywood, which has great cores. You do need to pre-prime the underlayment because of the aggressive grain pattern. So finally, all the panels have been dimensioned, cut to size, they've been pocket screwed, they've had any kind of shelf pins drilled, anything that needs to happen before assembly is now done. And the last step before assembly is to give everything a sanding with 220 grit sandpaper. And this will make for a really nice, smooth, silky smooth finish. And then that way you don't have to do any sanding after assembly. On the first video in this series, I talked about how a lot of people really don't like cabinet work and they feel like it's just tedious work. And I think really that really comes down to what are you doing in your pre-assembly processes to make the finished work and the assembly go as easy as possible. And I think if you do that, then really the work becomes a joy. And so that's what I'm doing here. 220 grit is more than sufficient. You could probably even go 180 grit, but I like 220 grit. Gives it a nice smooth finish. All right, guys, so all of our components are finished. All the assembly prep is complete. We're ready to start our assembly. So that's gonna be it for this video. On part 3 of our series, we're gonna start the assembly. And so at this point, when you've been doing all this work, everything from design, materials acquisition, you've done all your dimensioning and assembly prep, it's a ton of work. And it's kind of unrewarding because you haven't seen anything really come together into the shape and form of what you're trying to create. But you'll see on this next video, everything comes together very quickly. Everything's pre-finished, it's nice and smooth. It's like, bam, you get you some finished cabinets. So come back, we're gonna get all of our assembly done, we're gonna get our finished work started, and then eventually we're gonna install this bad boy. So check it out. If you haven't liked the video, please like it. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing to our channel. Hit the bell so you get all the latest notifications for our latest videos. And we'll see you guys at part 3. God bless.